Okay, psychodynamics, let's get the ball rolling on this. So again, it doesn't matter too much, how well you wrap your head around all the details of each of these. We're going to reiterate each of these 5 perspectives every time they become relevant over the course of the semester, but this is laying that essential groundwork so that you know what to expect as we talk about them going forward. And in case you missed it in that last video, I'm not going to do psychodynamics in a separate video on behaviorism. I'm going to move through all 5 of these as part of one video, which hopefully will not go over 10 minutes, but I'll see how I do with it. So psychodynamics. Psychodynamics was the school of thought, and we often refer to it as a school of thought these days rather than as a branch of psychology, just because it was still on that cutting edge when most of what Sigmund Freud was doing was still, in many ways, speculation and philosophy, and it would be many years before various elements of psychodynamics were regrounded in robust empiricism. But it was largely a therapeutic tradition that Sigmund Freud did. He would train other psychoanalysts to pull off these techniques of helping people with talk therapy and things like this. He would work with hypnotherapists and things like that back in the day, would do free association, everything that we think of as the modern talk therapies of how somebody can be led through by a therapist to mentally heal themselves in various ways by how they think and expose themselves in various ways with regards to their neuroses. That all has its roots in Freudian psychodynamics, and psychodynamics as a body of theory was what Freud had to explain the underlying nature of the human mind with relation to this. Now, I have to emphasize, it is the most weakly empirically grounded of all of the perspectives we're going to be looking at, while a lot of the bits and pieces of Freud's applied therapy still get used by therapists today, because even though they don't seem to make sense in the way that Freud understood them, they still have a certain degree of therapeutic efficacy to them. The most important things we're going to focus on here is that core element of why it is called psychodynamics. Freud's initial insight that the mind is not a unitary entity. You don't have just one mind that has only one set of intentions and works like a well-oiled machine inside itself, but rather that the mind has different functional parts, that your desires and your will and your memories function slightly independently of each other, and due to that can come into conflict with each other. That intrapsychic conflict is what the whole theory is named after. It is the dynamic within the psyche. It is psychodynamics. So we all know Sigmund Freud, and there's a lot of funny associations that we have with him these days. That's why I always pick a picture of Sigmund Freud that has a symbolic cigar of some sort. The cigar is not always a cigar. But when we're talking about the key insights of what psychodynamics means for us today, aside from a lot of its kind of funnier historical baggage, we're really talking about that core insight that people experience a wide range of sometimes contradictory desires and impulses, which can cause behavioral conflict, not only between the desires themselves, but with the constraints of reality. That people want to do things that they can't do, and this is a source of psychological distress. Also key, like a key insight that came from Freud and his contemporaries, is this notion that much of our psychological activity, we take it for granted these days, occurs outside of conscious awareness. We have an unconscious component to our mind, or what is sometimes called the subconscious component of our mind, where things are ticking over, meaningful distinctions are being made, reactions to the environment are being made, but we are not consciously aware of them. It's only a subset of what we are aware of that is our consciousness. And of course, because Freud focused a lot on psychosexual development, this idea that we must, over the course of our lives, develop techniques and mechanisms. Freud talked a lot about defense mechanisms, for example, to cope with our internal and external conflicts in order to maintain the function of ourselves. We are trying to be functional beings all the time, even though we don't always pull it off perfectly, and a lot of our pathologies are coping mechanisms, are ways that we hold ourselves together and try to maintain our psychological self-esteem. So this image here is just a way of breaking down some of the key elements of terminology here. We often talk about the iceberg metaphor when talking about psychodynamics, because consciousness is the little part that sticks out of the surface, but most of an iceberg is underneath, just like most of your mentality is underneath. When we talk about personality psychology later on, we'll talk about Freud's essential distinctions between the id, the source of all your desires, the ego, the aware part of you that parses what you need to do, and the superego, the part of you that is morally aware of the demands of the world around you. But those are the nuts and bolts of psychodynamic theory. Next one is behaviorism, which, like I was saying before, we're moving forward in time here. Freud was kind of the late 1800s, and he lived on beyond that and had more influence. But in the early 1900s, and around the 1910s to the 1930s, is when behaviorism came to dominate. And the best way to understand behaviorism is as a methodological revolt. It was a reaction to what was seen as the highly abstract, low scientific credentials of Freudian psychodynamics. Freud was the big name in town. They wanted to usurp him and say, no, let's get back to basics here. Let's do as rigorous and observable a science as we can to get away from some of the Freudian baggage of his more abstract ideas. So the notion was to try to increase psychology's scientific credentials by giving an account of psychological activity that only makes reference to observable behaviors. They would make no mental indeterminacies, no mental inferences whatsoever. You would just say, this is the stimulus in the environment, this is the behavior that was invoked, and by plotting out complicated relationships between the two of them, you'll be able to uncover fundamental laws of psychological life, of how we react to the environment and how the environment impresses upon us. So there were a number of key figures in this. Again, behaviorism was a big movement at the time. These are the main ones we are going to focus on. We'll talk about Thorndike, who came up with the basic law of effect, one of the biggest foundations of behaviorism as we know it. We'll talk about Ivan Pavlov, for whom classical or Pavlovian conditioning is named. We'll talk about the particularly clinically worrying case of Watson and his little Albert example. And we'll talk a lot about Skinner, B.F. Skinner, who developed operant conditioning as we know it today, how behavior is shaped by its responses. And these are the key insights to take out of it. I mean, they're less so insights when we're talking about behaviorism as they are a robust taxonomy of principles and terminology that they developed back in the day when they were doing behaviorism. For example, you'll hear about classical conditioning, that all animals that have a nervous system can make predictive associations between stimuli they're exposed to in the environment. We'll talk about operant conditioning, the way that all animals try to adaptively shape their outcomes and their behavior based on what happens to them when they behave. If they are reinforced for their actions, they do that behavior more. If they're punished for their actions, they do it less in a set of complicated, contextual circumstances. And we'll talk about elements like stimulus generalization as well. This idea that learned information or learned behavior patterns from one context can often be generalized into new contexts to provide new adaptive and sometimes maladaptive behaviors. So again, all the connotations of, dogs drooling when you ring bells, rats pushing levers in Skinner boxes, things like this, that is the essence of behaviorism. It is still very much with us, but it is with us only methodologically. Their theoretical commitment to not talking about mental activity is long dead because of cognitive psychology. So after the prominence of behaviorism, people were trying to go back in as scientific a way as they could manage to talking about mental events. Psychology is, as you imagine, fundamentally incomplete if you can't talk about what's going on inside of someone's head, what is going on in the content of their consciousness. You don't want to pretend that doesn't exist when we are all very aware that it does. So cognitive psychology had a brand new wedge on the issue. They had a brand new set of tools. In the cognitive revolution, as it was called, of the mid-20th century, the 50s and 60s, which was the computer. Not so much that it was just about the parsing of information using computers, but using the computer as a model for what we now understand the brain to be. The brain as an information processing device. Not just as, a set of bells and whistles or as a toothpastey substance that exists inside your skull, but your brain is optimized to detect patterns, to make simple judgments, for those simple judgments to add up upon each other until complex behavior emerges. That in many ways, we are analogous to digital computers in the way that our brains function. We just have a different design architecture. We have this kind of vastly parallel design architecture where we have a lot of things going on simultaneously. So this relied a lot on the early models of people like Jerry Fodor or the psycholinguist Noam Chomsky, putting together these models based purely on the notion of if a computer was trying to solve the problems that we know a human being can solve, parsing, depth perception, object recognition, sentence generation, how we remember specific events, how we pay attention to a subset of our sensory experience, all of these things are things that our brain, on the level of neural circuitry, we nowadays can confirm, does just by processing information, by turning signals into other signals, and by modeling how a computer would do this in our place. Again, the brain as a computer kind of metaphor. We've gained tremendous insights in what to look for inside the human brain, how to break down the functional sub-elements of how the brain does what it does. So these are the key insights of cognitive psychology. Neural activity processes information in a manner analogous to a digital computer. They have their on and off signals through semiconductive transistors printed onto circuit boards. We have the firing frequencies, as they come in and surmise in different ways between neurons that are in communication with each other. It's a neural network style model. We can gain insights into how the various functions of human mental activity work by trying to recreate those steps in computer models. Again, we're in tremendous insights. Even if they don't work out exactly the same way, the human brain isn't always the most efficient thing in the world. It gives us tremendous insight into what the steps need to be and what we should be looking for on the level of neural circuitry. And another big thing that really became big in the era of cognitive psychology was brain damage offers us an insight into how the functions of the brain can be regionalized. People who have rail spikes go through their heads or who have strokes that damage particular areas of their brain, the functionality that they lose gives us a cognitive insight into what those regions of the brain did as computational devices, what they contributed to the whole. So I put this slide up here just to make the parallel with behaviorism here. While behaviorism treated all of internal life and mentality as a black box that you in principle cannot study, cognitive models use the computer analogy and use stepwise algorithmic processes to imagine what these mediational processes that happen between our ears could be, and then we use in the modern era things like lesion studies, neuroimaging and things like this to see how well we're filling in the gaps. Humanistic psychology is a fairly straightforward one here. As you may imagine from the way I was just describing cognitive psychology, psychology became very non-therapeutic in the middle of the 20th century. It was very much focused on building up theories of human beings as if they were robots, yada yada yada. In that vein, the kind of this relative neglect of new theoretical perspectives for therapy gave birth to what we nowadays call humanistic psychology, mostly in the 70s and 80s, but carried on from there, which was to say, given this new information we have, given what we now know about how the human mind works, can we reinvent therapy to be something bigger than what it was in Freud's day? Can it be not just about mental healing, but flourishing on a mental level? And that's the important thing about humanistic psychology, with figures like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow we'll learn about as we go along here, is that it's a mode of therapeutic interaction not focused purely on restoring lost functionality to the mentally ill, although that's still very important, but also about how therapy or therapeutic interactions or changing of people's life circumstances can help any person achieve greater fulfillment out of life, to get more meaning out of life and enjoy it more. So that all of the modern, highly inclusive models of therapy we have today are heirs to this approach. They follow in the footsteps of the movement of humanistic psychology. So when we think about what the key insights are that are still meaningful for us today in humanistic psychology, it is that the most helpful way to approach any intervention, whether it's a health intervention, whether it's therapy, whether it's trying to bring people down from addiction, things like this, is to approach your clients or your patients with unconditional positive regard. It opens up the social pathways between people. We also learn from humanistic psychology that while people have many and varying needs, that the needs themselves are inherently tiered to a certain degree. They're not all made equal. Some people have great limitations on what can be rewarding or fulfilling in their lives because of the limitations placed on them by having their more fundamental needs not met. The limitations of poverty, the limitations of having a precarious or unsafe situation in life. And if you've ever heard about the concept of self-actualization, what it is to become the fullest version of yourself, to engage in individual terms with the way to live a meaningful life, that comes from humanistic psychology as well. And again, you'll see the hierarchy of needs later on. You'll see this idea of self-perception being important in humanistic psychology as we go forward. And the very last aspect of this, I'm going quite over time on this, it's probably be about 15 minutes here, is evolutionary psychology, a topic very close to my heart because I use its methodologies quite a lot. Most recent game-changing insight in psychology as a field would be the increased interdisciplinary collaboration between biologists and ethologists and psychologists to give us what we nowadays refer to as evolutionary psychology, although it was called sociobiology briefly back in the day before it was fully formulated. Really, when we're talking about evolutionary psychology, we're taking the insights of cognitive psychology and of humanistic tiering of our priorities and things like this, and putting them in an evolutionary context, saying that, the central thing that we're running on here, Charles Darwin really contributed this central notion to us, but it was built up a lot by researchers like John Tooby, who was an anthropologist, and Leah Cosmides, who was a cognitive psychologist. The notion is complicated biological structures, like the kind found inside the human brain, only emerge under one set of circumstances in the natural world, and that is under selective pressures by natural selection. That is to say that it's the constraints from the environment for the things that make a difference to whether you'll reproduce successfully, whether you'll survive encounters with predators or rivals and things like this. It is purely on the level of perpetuating greater gene frequencies that any complicated structures get selected into being, and therefore that means that all the complicated structures that make up our minds, the intuitions we inherit, the biases that optimize the way we perform in the world, are a form of mental adaptations. They must be shaped by the nature of our evolutionary history. So these are the key insights of evolutionary psychology. All cross-culturally stable, intuitive features of human psychology, the kind of things that we know have a strong biological basis because they're just there for everybody, are heritable adaptive responses to the reoccurring survival and reproductive challenges of our ancestors. That our brain is a kind of behavioral toolkit that has a lot of specialized tools inside of it for solving the behavioral problems that made the difference between life and death, successful or unsuccessful reproduction for most of human history. In addition to this, we have an understanding that the more we know about human evolutionary history and the constraints of it, the better hypotheses we can generate to understand hidden features of our psychology today. The hidden strengths and limitations of how our minds work are largely shaped by what did and did not count as success in part of our evolutionary history. And perhaps most importantly, it'll come up in the health context, is it explains why we have a certain degree of mismatch to the modern world. Evolution is a very powerful generative process, but it is a slow process. So, we have innovated as a society to an enormous degree. We have a complicated modern world that in some ways we are not especially well adapted to. We have adaptations built for a simpler mode of life than we have. We haven't been able to evolutionarily catch up all the way yet, and therefore some modes of psychological pathology that we have aren't really maladaptation per se. It's various ways in which the modern world doesn't fit the brains that we have. So, there's no good way to visualize evolutionary psychology, so I just like this, ascent of man becoming a guy with a laptop sort of approach. Now, I have some other things here that you guys can look through on the slides if you want to look at this exhaustively. A couple of ways that you break down the comparisons between these different perspectives from the textbook. And of course, these aren't entirely exhaustive. These are the things that have been picked out as being especially useful for how we are going to teach this course, but there are many other perspectives that we could in principle draw on that give us similar insights along the way. There are many different contemporary fields of psychology that have their own methodologies and sub-practice to them. Just to give some quick examples, biopsychology, developmental psychology, how children grow up and develop the way they do, social psychology, clinical psychology, the main vocation of doing psychotherapy with people, personality psychology, organizational psychology, how people fit in at their jobs and how you can optimize workflow, educational psychology, health psychology is a very big one for us, how people manage their health concerns, counseling psychology, sports psychology, how you get high performance behavior out of people through psychological techniques, forensic psychology, the profiling of people who have a psychopathology that leads them towards modes of crime, conservation, neuropsychology, etc. The field is very, very broad, but I'm going way over time on this. Again, I'm trying to mostly stick to 10-minute videos, but I've bunched a bunch of things here together for convenience's sake. Next week, we will talk about learning and applied behaviorism, specifically in the context of how we change behavior in human beings in the most beneficial and least intrusive ways we can manage, but you will all see me then. Bye.